All right, it's time for another update on the Airtruk. So while I go over some of the things that have been covered on this project over the past several weeks, actually a couple months now since I've last updated you on this, I'm going to roll some B-roll so that you can see this thing more up and close and personal and be able to really tell what's been going on. First and foremost, you can tell just by looking at it that the fuselage is done. The top piece has been epoxied on. I blended it in. I covered the whole thing in fiberglass cloth, and I used sanding sealer to apply it. I didn't use epoxy. Now, I did try something new on that, but I'm going to go into that technique later in another project. I used this as a test subject for it. It worked really well. So moving forward with it, I'm going to show you guys how to do that later as I get more familiar with that process. So with that, you'll notice that obviously everything is painted. Painted a base white. It's a satin white. And actually there are two different brands, and I did that on purpose. The two different brands having the same white, they're not the same color, obviously. So what I wanted to capture with this kind of paint, this base paint, is the kind of ridden hard, put away wet kind of feel. These things used as agricultural machines were not, civilian, not flown by dentists or doctors or things like that. These were hard farmers, I'm not saying that they were uneducated people. I'm just saying that these were used as machines. They were intended to be as machines. And all of the reference pictures that I've seen of them, there's lots of variation between them because they were fixed in the field. They were modified in the field for specific uses or specific servicing. So I try to reflect that. And the reason why is I wanted to capture what the original builder had put into this. I didn't want to go completely crazy and go all my style on this airplane because I feel it's important to perpetuate our hobby and the history of what we have. And that includes the builders that we have, not just the models. So I have left some of the covering not completely finished. The weave not filled, and that's particularly on the bottom wing, where the primer was applied, I think, a little preemptively. There's some holes in the fiberglass that was applied, but I decided to leave it because that captures the original builder's build techniques. Doesn't necessarily reflect on everything else in the model, but there you go. Obviously, I had to go through a lot of pain and suffering, really, to put in a door on the model. The door, in my opinion, was necessary because the model came with a seat and an instrument panel, and both of those things I wanted to include in the model. So in order to really access those, I wanted to include a scaled door, which involved doing some framework as well as hinging, and then a clever closing mechanism. I wanted to use something that was a little unobtrusive but secure, so I found these like closing latches that work really well. You just push it in and it pops open, push it again and it secures it again. It's great. It's great. I could have used a hatch latch, but that wouldn't have been that scale. I wanted to try to create a more scale flush appearance. I know there's a latch there, but I didn't want to include that because that would likely break off. But that being said, everything else is wrapped up on the fuselage. I've left the canopy covered for now because I'm not done with the paint. The paint, I haven't decided on a final color. I will do some variation of stripes or pinstriping or something like that with either a red that's kind of like a dusty barn red, a little bit darker, not quite fire engine bright red, or an orange. I haven't fully decided. Both are quite visible and give me good orientation. It's a really strange looking airplane, so I want to try to do colors that will help me keep my orientation when I fly the model. Obviously, I'm not very familiar with it. As I get more familiar with how it flies, it'll be a lot easier to tell orientation, but that's just the way it goes. Let me grab the wings, or at least one wing, and I'll go over what has been done there. All right, so I have one wing here. As you can see, I've been able to finish all of the corrugations on the tail surfaces. I also have spider webs forming because I have way too many airplanes in my basement that they're being stored. Pieces of them are being stored all over the place. So that being said, let's get this on the bench. We have ailerons with a trim tab as well as flaps. So both of these had to be made from scratch, and that was kind of a bit of a chore. I didn't have any plans to go off of, but I knew I just needed something simple since it's really square. Ended up making some custom angled triangles based off of the root, and that seemed to work pretty well, but it did take a pretty considerable amount of time. I was able to replace the hardware with some steel stuff from Dubro rather than the plastic stuff that was there, just for more secure linkages. And then the servos inside, because I showed you previously how they're like kind of flip up and stuff, I noticed that there was quite a bit of slop on particularly the elevator. Did some investigation, and the elevator does have a bell crank system in the vertical stabilizer. So I couldn't just, try to wrap up some of the push rod slop possibly. What ended up being a big contributor was two things. Number one, the mounting system was kind of torquing a little bit inside of the wing, so I was able to secure that better, number one. Number two, the older servos that are supplied are they're non-standard. I mean, they fit a standard size hole, but not a standard size depth, so they're a little bit shorter in height. So I'm still on the lookout for a form factor for those to replace them, because the splines themselves that protrude from the case of the servo, they're not on a bearing. They have quite a bit of shaft play. So I want to try to replace those as soon as I can, but I'm still looking for the right size. It's not very common. So more on that as I get to it. But that being said, the wings assemble fine. I've been able to program them, all of the control surfaces just fine as well. And I was able to take this out to the field for a taxi test. Now, a taxi test showed a couple of things. That was before I did all the elevator servo adjustments and discovered the things about the elevator. So the elevators look a little funky. There was some mechanical adjustment that needed to be done there too. Didn't really know that until I had it out of the field. I've gone through with an incidence meter and checked the horizontal stabilizer incidence as well as the elevator angle. Make sure that it's even on both sides, make sure that I'm not going to have any weird roll that I'm not going to be able to overcome. Check out my rates, my expo, all of the radio programming, things like that. It turns really well, it tracks really well. I think it's got plenty of power, and there's nothing that really rattled loose or came loose that was, alarming. So I think at this point that the airplane is just about ready for a maiden. Now I say just about because there's really one thing left that I want to build per se that has not been built yet, and that is on the wing. On the full scale, there are some fences that go right here, and I believe that those fences are there to help mitigate some vortices that might come from the wings that would interfere with the tail. And I want to try to replicate those just because that may prove true on this large of an aircraft as well. So I want to get a profile from the root of the wing and put the fences on in the scale location. So more on that to come. Should be pretty straightforward to do. Just need to get the profile, create the fences, and then I can put a mark in the wing, the top of the wing, dig a little trench with a number 11 blade, and then put it in place with epoxy. Should be really quite straightforward. All I gotta say is that I'm really pleased with how this is wrapping up. It's been a really fun time to take a break away from the Saab, away from other things that I've got going on in my life, and look at this completely weird airplane. I'm so glad that it has come my way, and I hope that it proves to be a very excellent flyer. But for now, that will do. Just been a lot of work here and there. I've put more base paint on the tail as well, since it was just in primer. More to come on the paint, and hopefully the next video will be a maiden flight. Who knows? We'll see what the weather holds out for now. We've got some pretty strange weather going on these days in our area. It's February and the trees are blooming, as well as my garden is already starting to green up and push through flowers. So who knows? We'll see if we have an early spring here and be able to get out to the flying field for a maiden on this one. But until next time, guys, keep working on building your flying works of art.